Good morning. Good morning, Father. Great to be with you all on this wonderful, finally proper spring morning. This is delightful.
In Ireland, maybe.
Really great. Since we're talking about St. Patrick, this is a late July sort of.
That's right, August, morning,
in Ireland. So great to have the Reverend Brian Dixon, our very own, tell us a bit about, even in, the Feast of St. Patrick is so popular that in the Roman Church, all the bishops have to grant formal dispensation
from Lent,
because no matter what, the people are going to have a huge party.
That's right.
With or without the dispensation. The rivers will be green in Chicago and on and on. It is a fun day. I'm looking forward to hearing about this. I'm wondering if we'll hear anything about, are there snakes really in Ireland?
Never were.
Because I was always told St. Patrick drove them out of Ireland. Has anybody done Ancestry DNA or any of those things that kind of tell you where, I see a bunch of hands. I did it. I did it primarily because my dad he would have a few drinks and start to tell me that my great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess. And that turned out not to be true. But it turned out that I'm about 9% Irish.
Wilson, big name.
9%. And my redheaded wife is more Irish than I am. And our children, so that's awesome. Well, a real Irishman. I'll just say who's come in for the day.
All right.
To enlighten us about St. Patrick. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Father Charlson. And great sermon.
I'll get out of your hair here. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, about this, I need to stick to a script because I think, Father, you want to get back to service, some of you. There aren't any snakes in Ireland. I think the Ice Age was hard on them. And in fact, about 13,000 years ago, you could have walked to Ireland on an ice bridge. So this year, after a 3-year absence, Dublin will feature a St. Patrick's Day parade on the day with its attendant festivities. And already in the United States, celebrations have been held because they did it this weekend rather than on the day itself. And my grandniece who's visiting showed me a picture of the Green River in Chicago. And of course, copious volumes of beer, green beer, will be consumed. And of course, all that beer will have to be recycled. It was the issue of offloading excessive beer that gave rise to a friend of mine from Donegal lamenting the way and manner in which St. Patrick's Day has come to be maligned. She and her husband owned a home in South Boston. If some of you are from that area, you'll know all about it. It was once said to be the Irish part of Boston. No longer. You need to be a millionaire to live there, like Sarasota. But her home, or their home, happened to be on the parade route. And she operated a small restaurant, very good fish and chips. And she said to me, they're using my backyard as a toilet. Is that all we Irish have contributed to civilization? Well, she might ask. So, who was St. Patrick and why has he been granted a named Saint's Day? I would begin simply by saying that I cannot remember a time in my life when I did not know something of the story of St. Patrick. I must have been a very small boy when my mother told me about Patrick. Let's see, the computer's behind me here, so this is Slemish Mountain, and that was the dominant feature on the horizon east of where we lived, maybe 10 or 12 miles. And it's not a very tall mountain, it's only 1,300 feet, and it's named Slemish. But we could see it where I grew up every day, as I have said, 10 or 12 miles away. And I can imagine as a just waist high maybe to my mum asking her, what is that? And she told me the story of St. Patrick. There, she said, St. Patrick first came as a slave to look after sheep and pigs. And he had been captured and brought there. And after about 5 or 6 years, he escaped and ran away and got back home. And then, she said, he came back to tell us that God loved us. So that's the story. Years later, I came to know more about the story. I read St. Patrick's Confessions, a document ostensibly from the mouth of Patrick. The copy that we now have dates from several centuries after his lifetimes. And I should note that the term confessions does not mean a visit to Father Charleston to mea culpa, but rather it's a profession setting forth what he believed in the story of his faith. He tells how he and a company of boys were playing by the seaside, and how some marauders came down, captured them all, and took them all away. They brought them to Ireland, and he tells that he walked 200 miles. And here, this tradition is strong that it was Slamish Mountain to which he was brought. And here for 6 years, he looked after sheep and pigs. His grandfather was a priest and his father a deacon in the church. And when he was in captivity here in Ireland, near this region, looking after sheep and pigs, it dawned on him as a youth that he had not appreciated his faith and the faith of his family the way they ought to. So he was greatly, his faith was renewed, and his faith, he tells us, sustained him through those 6 years or so of captivity. He escaped, as I have said, after 6 years, and as he tells us in the Confessions, he walked the 200 miles back and crossed the sea. We think he was probably a lot of discussion about it, but perhaps somewhere off the coast of Wales, there's a short crossing over to Ireland, and then 200 miles north here. When he went back, he went into Christian ministry training, and at the end of that, he took holy orders, as he tells us, as both a presbyter and a bishop, although there's no record of his see. So then, when he was finished training, he prayed, "Dear God, what will I now do?" And he had a vision. And these Irish people from this part of the world were saying, "Dear boy, come back and help us." I wonder if he thought, "God, you have one wicked sense of humor. I was there, I didn't like it." But he did return and proclaimed the Christian gospel. And of course, remember that the country was largely pagan at the time, and his return is dated from about 432. I should have mentioned that we think he dates from about 390 to 460, or roughly the years of his life. So he came back in 432, as we think, and he walked the 200 miles back. Now I want to show a map of Ireland here. Now, let's see, I think I can move. So I had a pointer, but when you move, things disappear. The region we're talking about, up near the top of the map in the right, well, first of all, orientation. Dublin down here on the right, Galway almost across on the left, Cork down at the bottom, Belfast up there, and Derry just top centre. So you'll maybe see north of Belfast a place marked Ballymena. Now, I grew up near there, east of there, toward the river. Slamish Mountain is, I grew up west of there, and east of that is where this Slamish Mountain is. And that's where we think St. Patrick came back to and began his ministry. And as I said, the country was pagan, and he was fearless in proclaiming the love of God and the threat of doom and judgment on the day of doom. And he would go to the tribal chiefs. Ireland was very tribal, of course, clannish. And for some reason, they accepted what he had to say. And he had tremendous success planting communities wherever there were tribal groups based. He would go there and proclaim a wonderful success. Now, a dominant feature of Patrick's teaching and preaching was the Holy Trinity. Now, I can imagine that in the 21st century, if you're thinking about evangelizing, you probably wouldn't start with the Holy Trinity. But the doctrine of the Holy Trinity was a crucial factor in the earliest Christian church. And the Orthodox tradition to this day still maintains that's the fundamental ground of all theology. So as Patrick is preaching to these non-believers and trying to convert them to Christianity and telling them about the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, they say, "You have three gods." He said, "No, I don't." And what genius to look down and find a plant the size of your thumbnail. I should have brought some with me. And say, here's a plant. It's a single plant. It's got 3 leaves. That's the Trinity. That's like the Trinity. And so that's how come the shamrock is so dear to all of us in Ireland. It always was a symbol of God. And what's that line of William Blake's? To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Patrick could take this simple plant and demonstrate how the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were all one. And so I might say that there's also another evidence of the importance of the Trinity for Patrick. In our hymnal, The Breastplate of St. Patrick, in the Irish church hymnal, there's 9 verses, and ours there's 7, so it kind of shortchanged us here. But I bind unto myself today the strong name of the Trinity. And you can read it for yourself. It's number 370. And then Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me. It's this breastplate of St. Patrick. I don't know how it comes down to us, but that's the story. And so this emphasis on the Trinity was so important. And the other thing I would say about the shamrock is it shows another important emphasis of the Celtic Church, a great veneration for nature. We are very close to pagans still. But it's God's creation, and we should venerate it. So the Celtic Church was green a long time before the year 2000, let me tell you. Well, St. Patrick, I could go back again to the Irish map, and he established the headquarters of the church at Armagh. Now let's see, that's about 2/3 of the way up the map, and on the right side, go straight north of Dublin and a little to the left, and you'll see Armagh, Armagh. And that is still the headquarters of the Christian church in Ireland for both the Protestant and the Catholic traditions. And it remains that way. It was established by Patrick. He died at a place called Saul near Downpatrick, which is over on the east. If you look just right of Belfast, you'll see a place, Bangor, and then Donaghadee. Just in that area there is where Saul is in the County Down. And it's alleged that this is supposed to be his grave marker, but whether I wouldn't stake my salvation on it, I'll tell you. But you'll see there the image of Patrick. Well, that's a brief outline of Patrick's life. Now, one of the things that I said, he had great success in establishing the church because he went to where the tribal chiefs were and got their sanction and approval and so on. But there was a downside, because after Patrick's death in about 461, the tribal chiefs and clan chiefs just took it upon themselves to appoint bishops. And they would do this, they sometimes, they did this in Armagh, they made the order office of bishop hereditary. They even appointed lay people. And this was to be reformed in later years, largely because of the Irish missionaries who went over to Europe, and then their successors came back to Ireland, and this all got reformed. So he started a movement that changed the world. It's that simple. That's not just an Irish thing to say, that's the truth. And he had successors. We really don't know much about the very next generation. We know more about his grandchildren, so to speak. And the other two great Irish saints are St. Brigid and St. Columba. Brigid lived around 450 to 525. Her mother was a Christian. Her father wasn't. He was one of the kings in Leinster. But tradition holds that Brigid's mother was a convert under Patrick, and she shared that faith with her daughter Brigid, who was a woman of great beauty. But she gave up marriage to serve Christ, and she gathered together a community in Kildare, which is just a little bit west of Dublin, very close to Dublin, really. And she gathered this community around her, and they excelled in doing charitable acts, maybe like helping the people in Ukraine. God have mercy. And she then thought that she should be made the abbess of this little community. She called in a bishop to do that, and for some reason, speculation about it, he read the wrong prayer, consecrated her a bishop. There's discussion as to which spirit he was under. But she continued through all her life and she's honored on February 1st to do great works. Now, Columba, he was also a grandson, so to speak, and he was from around Donegal. He was the son of a clan chieftain in Ulster, and he gave up his hereditary right to be a clan chieftain to become a follower of Christ. Now, he is sometimes referred to as the dove of the church because his name in Latin means dove, column. And there's a very significant story about Columba. He's just about as Irish as you can get. He gathered a community, and I don't know how it happened, nobody does. He borrowed a copy of the Gospels. And then he thought it would be a wonderful thing if one of the brothers made him a copy of that Gospel. The owner of the Gospel heard about this and was upset, to put it mildly. And so the whole thing went to court. And this, if some of you are in the legal profession, you may know this story, but it's a very old ruling in the old Brehon, B-R-E-H-O-N, law tradition. The judge was asked, to whom did the copy of the book belong? And it was his ruling, to every cow its calf, to every book its copy. And he said the owner of the original owned the copy. Now, sometimes people draw a straight line, but we really don't know. After that, soon after that, there was a battle in which Columba was involved and blood was shed. Some people speculate that it was because he was not awarded the book. We do not know that. But he did get involved in a battle, we know that, and then, whether it was a punishment or an act of penance on his own part, he left Ireland from Donegal. I could go back a couple here and, going the wrong way, Brian. If you look up Derry up at the top, or Glencollinkill, which is near Ballyshannon over there on the left, and went to Iona, Scotland. I think it's about 75 or 80 miles by water. And there he established a very famous community on the island of Iona. And it is literally impossible to overstate the significance of Iona for the history of Christendom, because it was from there under Columba that Christians went out to evangelize all over Scotland, all over England, and even into the continent of Europe more largely. And it's also known that on Iona was begun, if not completed, Ireland's greatest national treasure, the Book of Kells, which is a great story in itself. Now, the book was begun on Iona, perhaps, maybe not, we don't know, about 200 years after Columba's death, as far as we can tell. And I always wonder in my mind if after that story about the book that Columba didn't get to keep, some of the brothers said, by God, Columba will get you a better book. And it may be that, there were previous copies to the Book of Kells. We don't know. But they developed this book. Now, it's got a fascinating story, because when you get into the 700s, the marauders are coming down out of Northern Europe, and they're robbing particularly monasteries because they would have things of value. And so the community left Iona, and they brought with them the book, and they brought it to Kells, which is just a little north of Dublin, to a monastery there. And the marauders came there again, and the book was buried in the ground, and it has suffered some damage, but safely now in the library at Trinity College Dublin. And if some of you have been there, you may have seen it. It is called an Illuminated Gospel. And this is from the Gospel of Matthew. It's a very famous image. Some of you probably know it. The Chi-Rho page, the C-H-R-I. This is the beginning of the story in Matthew of the generation, the Christus. Probably, I'm not sure it's clear right there, but you can see G-E-N-E-R, Asion, the book of the generations of Jesus Christ. So that's from the Gospel of Matthew. And let's see another image here. Am I ahead of myself here? Yeah. These are the symbols of the four evangelists. Also from the upper left is Matthew, the divine man. Upper right is the symbol of Mark, a winged lion. Luke here, a winged ox, and then John the eagle. And these were the great symbols of the four evangelists. I might have another one up there. Let's see. Oh, that's padded, right? Yeah. Chi-Rho. Now, this I love particularly because to me it gives a flavor of the Irish church. This is from the Gospel of Matthew, the reading there at chapter 13, verses 18 through 22. It's after Jesus tells the parable of the sower, and this is where the interpretation comes. And why I love this, you see that two chickens and a rooster up there. Now, if you grew up in farm country, certainly in Ireland, when seed was being scattered, the chickens were out scratching among it to get the seed. So I always think it's just, there he is, he's writing this thing out meticulously by hand, and he decides, I'm going to include a couple of chickens and a rooster. It's just how earthy the Celtic church has been, and it always has been. And I hope it always will. And then this image. This is the oldest known depiction of the Virgin and Child, and it's in the Book of Kells. Now, of course, it doesn't count by modern art and the great Leonardos and all the rest of them, but you have to get to Giotto, I think, before you get much better than this. But it's the oldest known, and all of this is done with natural inks, no paint. So we're very proud of it, and it's a great book. Right, well, I better get on. One more person, Columbanus. He was also a grandson of St. Patrick, born around 543. He began his training in Enniskillen, which is near Donegal, and then he moved to Bangor, which was on the right of the map, away back when I got there. He moved over to Bangor, which is east of Belfast. He became proficient. He was a great scholar, proficient in Latin, of course, Hebrew, well, some Hebrew and lots of Greek. And he too was a fervent follower of Christ and proclaimer of the gospel. And one day, someone came from Europe, mainland Europe, because they had heard about this Irish church and all of these saints and scholars as the country was known. And they met Columbanus and they told him, no harm to anybody here, but the Germanic tribes in Europe needed evangelization. And so Columbanus set off. He went round the coast, as was the usual thing, and he came to a place in Burgundy, Luxeuil, and established a monastery there. And he got into some trouble because the king was Theodoric. He had fathering children by someone who wasn't his wife. They weren't married, and Columbanus, like John the Baptist in the Old Testament, told him he was out of order. He was upset, but his mother was even more upset, Brunhild, and she told her son to banish him. Well, first of all, he imprisoned her, then he did banish him. And Columbanus was later released from prison and moved to an area around Zurich, Switzerland. And as bad luck would have it, Theodoric took over that region too and discovered that Columbanus was there and banished him. And this time he was in the 70s. He walked into Italy, to Bobbio, and established one of the most famous and great monasteries in the history of Christendom. And St. Francis of Assisi spent some time there. And that was one of the most influential. He wrote letters to the Pope. He had a great sense of humor, and there's just a lot of history we can't talk about today. He's honored on November 23. So this is just a brief outline of the lives of St. Patrick and three of the most influential members of the Celtic Church. They spread out, and then, as I said, when the church was a little corrupted in Ireland, their ancestors came back, or their successors came back, and the church was reformed and Armagh was put in good order. Well, that's a brief overview of Patrick and why we love him and honor him, and whether drinking gallons of green beer is the best way to celebrate his life, I don't quite know. Now, I don't want to suggest I'm a teetotaler. That wouldn't work. And if you did want to have a drink to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, there's a little village there. It's probably not on that map. It's north of Ballymena, and it's probably 30 miles roughly north of where the mountain Slamish was. And it's a beautiful drive. And there's only 2 streets in the town. It's called Bush Mills. And it has the oldest licensed distillery in the world, 1608. And I can tell you that their 16-year-old whiskey is one of the highest rated whiskeys in the world, and you will not be drinking gallons of it with the price they're getting for it now. Anyway, you may have some questions, and I know time is an issue in trying to get back to service. That's rough and ready story of St. Patrick in the early Celtic Church.